Okay, so hopefully we got the stream right this time. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Clyde. I'll be your host today on behalf of Product People. Product People is we are a product management consultancy and a community builder, and these are sort of the two things that we do during the day. Mostly, we work as interim product managers and owners, doing the hands-on and unglamorous work of product. So we can make pretty decks, but we prefer to deliver outcomes. And by night, we masquerade as event hosts and networkers, bringing events and people like Sarah to speak and share insights into their daily work in their lives. Some of the clients that we've worked and are currently working with, Scout 24, Tier, Zalando, probably heard, especially if you're based in Germany, you've probably heard of a lot of these. And there are some other, probably maybe less known people as well, or companies. So tonight we have Sarah Gregory joining us from Coinbase to speak about user research. She's been in San Francisco for the past several years, moving there from Chicago due to the weather, which I think many of us could probably relate to at this point. So thanks, Sarah, for joining us, and feel free to share and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Great to be here. Let me take over the sharing. All right. Blue screen, I assume everybody's got it. All right, great. Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm going to speak today about some topics that I both love talking about. I love this stuff, working with product managers and product, and specifically focusing on some areas that I don't think get that much love in the speaker circuit. You know, trying to talk about some things, some more tactical process things that I think we often don't focus on. Who is this talk designed for? So I've been told that there are a lot of product managers and designers out there. So I have created this for you. And I know that myself, I've been a user researcher for a long time. I've never been a designer. I've never been a product manager. I have only ever been a researcher, and for a brief moment in the far past, a data analyst. So I've worked with many product managers, I've worked with many designers in a lot of different contexts. And so I know that everybody is in a little bit of a different situation with research. In a lot of cases, a company may have researchers. There may be many of them, but you always get a bunch of PMs and designers who are like, hey, what's the best way to engage with you? What's the best way to work with you? And maybe they've worked with researchers before, maybe they haven't. But in any case, I think that there are a lot of you out there who are potentially in that situation. So this talk is for you. And it may be the case that there are researchers wherever you are, but there aren't very many. Usually there are not nearly as many as there are PMs or designers. Their bandwidth might be quite limited. And so this talk is for you also. And I'm sure that there are some people who have actually never worked with a researcher and maybe do not currently, and you might need to do some research yourself, and there will be some tidbits in here for you. So the two main things that I'm going to talk about are what is the most impactful way to engage, since it's one of the most common questions that I get, and then some other tips for scaling research impact in those situations where there's an infinite number of questions you can ask, there's an infinite number of research projects that you want to be able to do because we love research and it's so great. Where are the highest leverage places to put your effort? If you really only can do a couple of things, what are the highest leverage things that you can do? All right, so I'll start with what is the most impactful way to engage with research, in my humble opinion. So to start, let's step back and start by talking about what are researchers actually responsible for? Because I think that understanding this is key to understanding how is the best way to engage with research. So The first thing that we're responsible for is making sure that decisions, wherever we are made using data and insights from users. So it's not just producing the research, it's not just creating the insights, it's making sure that those insights are actually impacting strategic decisions, whether they be large or small. We're also responsible for the quality of research execution. So whether we are executing research ourselves or we're helping other people, PMs and designers, execute their own research, which we will talk about today, just making sure that it is done in a way that you can trust the data. It doesn't have to be done by a researcher in order to be good research. And as you'll see in a lot of cases, the primary researcher is not the researcher themselves. And then the third thing is we want to help whomever we're working with understand where is research going to be the most impactful and where can it influence decisions. And a lot of times we don't expect the folks that we're working with to know this. People may not have a good idea of where research is going to be helpful or the decisions that are best impacted by it or what's the best way to proceed with research. And we don't expect you to know that before talking to us, which I'll cover. So notice how none of these three bullets are executing the research work. That is a big component of research, but it is not nearly the most important component of the research. It's all in how it's used, what is it impacting, and how are people understanding and using it. That is the most important thing that we hold ourselves responsible for. So given that, I'm going to go over for you the three components of a research plan. I never do research without a research plan. I don't think anybody should do research without a research plan. And I think that going over this will help us break down what are the areas that are most useful to engage on. So every time we do research, we don't start with the methodology. The methodology is actually way down there at the bottom. Is like, we don't start with, we're going to do surveys, we're going to do interviews, we're going to do prototype testing. No. We start way at the top with, what is the objective? What is it that we are trying to do? And a lot of the cases, maybe there's a metric that we want to impact. There's a particular decision that we want to make. We're deciding whether or not we should move forward with a feature. We're deciding, whether or not there's an opportunity in a particular space. And we want to be sure exactly what is that objective, because the way that we will judge the success of the research is based on that objective. Are we providing the right data that is going to allow us to do the thing that we want to do? Then once we have the objective, the business goal, then we go into the research questions. Well, what are the things we need to know in order to unlock that goal for us? What are the questions that need to be answered in order for this project to be considered a success? So start with the objective, then go to the research questions, and that'll show you what is it you need to learn from this study. Then once you've identified the objective and the research questions, then you go into methodology. Well, if there's this particular decision that we need to make, which necessitates this kind of information, the way that is the best way to get that information is using this particular research methodology: surveys, interviews, prototype testing, whatever the case may be. And we find that a lot of people want to jump to methodology, but it really helps the research be successful if you start with those two things on top. So what does that mean for engaging with research? Well, the first thing I'm always going to ask you, if you come to me and say that you're curious about doing user research, I'm always going to start with the objective. And that's what we're always going to talk about first. I actually don't necessarily expect you to have a good idea of what the research questions might be or what the methodology is going to be, because that's not where I'm going to start. That's actually what I'm responsible for. As you know, as we went over, a researcher considers themselves responsible for helping whoever they're working with understand where research is going to be the most impactful. That means that that blue box is what I can help you with. I don't expect you to know that before you talk to me. I just need a vague idea of what's the objective that we want to accomplish, and I can help you figure out the rest. So when you're working with a researcher, then try to think of your objective to start and base the conversation around that, rather than coming and prescribing, hey, I think we should do surveys, I think we should do interviews. If you aren't working with a researcher, if you're in that third group of PMs or designers who might need to execute yourself, try structuring your research plan, literally write it down in a document. what are these 3 things for the research that you're planning to do? Start with the objective. Don't even plan out the research questions and methodology. A lot of times when folks are not professionally trained researchers, they skip this step. Document it, write it down, go back to it so that you can always go back and prove this is what we set out to do. This is why we set out to do it. And that'll help your research be all the more successful. So why do we prefer to engage in this way? I'll show you some ways to think about this. So let's say you come to me and you say, hey, and by the way, I totally made this up. I have no idea whether we are or not considering this. I totally just pulled it from nowhere. You'll say, we're talking about doing a Coinbase podcast in Q1. Do we need research? Should we not, like how is this, do we even want to do research for this? What would the research look like? We're not even sure. Should research even be involved? Because already we have the business objective. The business objective is we want to decide whether or not we're going to do a podcast. Very clear goal. So the reason that we want to start there is because we may respond in a variety of different ways. We may say, hey, we actually don't need to do any new research. We already know that people have just been clamoring for a podcast. Here, let me send you, a million existing studies where we don't have to conduct any net new research. We know for a fact many data points supporting that we should do a podcast. So let's just get started. No research needed. I may say, hey, how would we decide to do a podcast? Are we really going to base that decision based on user research? Or are we realistically going to decide whether or not to do a podcast based on any number of other valid reasons? Maybe we know that there's a critical industry need. We know that the CEO really wants to. We know that it's a strong brand play. We know that sometimes legal, that you're doing things because there's a legal reason. In those situations, if research is not really going to impact the decision, then it becomes this like, why are you doing the research in the first place? Because remember, the goal is to just get you the information you need to accomplish whatever it is. And if the decision will not be impacted by user research, then great, let's identify that and we can save ourselves some time. We may have a strong hypothesis. Maybe we have not done any prior research on podcasts, but we have a lot of data points that are kind of converging on, we know enough about some tangential areas. We know people are very interested in certain audio forms of learning about crypto. We know that our competitor launched a podcast that's very useful or whatever. And it's like, okay, maybe we already have a strong enough hypothesis. Do we really need more research, or can we really just go based on the data points that we already have? What specifically are those research questions that stakeholders feel like they don't have any signal on? So in that situation, we'd be really focusing in on what are the research questions we want answered, because we probably already have some signal on some. And maybe we'll say, yes, of course, we need research on podcasts. Let me whip up a research plan for you that's going to have those 3 components. Or maybe I say something else, but there's only one way to find out what I'm going to say. So that's why we start with a business objective. And bonus, rather than even starting with the business objective, we actually love to back up even further than the business objective and say, hey, we're just trying to figure out what we should do. What should we do? What should we build? Where are the biggest opportunities for this quarter? Let's say it's a comms team, since we're talking about podcasts, communications team. What should the communications team be doing? Where are the biggest product opportunities? Where are the biggest user opportunities? What is it that they're really missing? We love this. I will always say, amazing question. Thank you for asking. Here is where I think users stand to benefit the most, and the biggest actionable areas that I think a comms team can do this quarter. And this is by far our preferred way to engage, because that's asking us to aggregate everything that we already know and then just give you what is it that we want you to do and what is going to be the highest impact for users. So if I'm a researcher, how do I know that I'm doing a good job? This is helpful for you to know, because it will, if you're a PM or you're a designer and you're like, hey, how can I best support my researcher? How can I make sure that all those goals are getting accomplished? How can I make sure that research is being used in the best way? Well, again, we want decisions to be based on evidence we have from users. So as long as decisions are being based in research, the users are going to get a better experience. So all of these tips that I have for you are your decisions being based on research? So You can tell us, like if you're working with a researcher, then let the researcher know, hey, this is the decision that, you know, got impacted by your research or that we think is going to be impacted. That really helps them know, hey, this is the kind of thing that's going to be very helpful. Maybe I should do more of that in the future. It helps them learn what about their process is actually working or not working. Are they successfully influencing decisions? When you have a decision that is influenced by research, cite the source. You know, somebody may say, why are we deciding to do a podcast? You should always say, oh, because of this study. There was a very clear finding from this study. They said they wanted a podcast, and actually include the evidence and the documentation that you're basing that decision off of. And as researchers, we don't even always necessarily expect you to do these things yourself. You can invite us. You can tag us in the document. We'll go put it in there. Invite us to the meeting. We'll present the study ourselves. A lot of times when it's coming from the researcher themselves, then we're able to represent the user's voice, and you don't have to have your stakeholders be like, yeah, don't take my word for it. The researcher is actually the expert best able to represent what the finding was. And then I just included down there, if your researcher is creating insights on a regular basis, the best way that you can help your researcher is read them, please. A lot of times there's great research happening, but it falls in a forest, and so therefore nobody hears it. So if there's knowledge being created, then the least, you know, anyone can do is at least just read it, and then it'll influence your decision making. How to use a research team. I would say the number one thing is just talk. I'm not a believer in request forms. I'm not a believer in really hardcore road mapping and you only talk to me once a quarter. Just ask, hey, you know, do we have anything existing on this? Do we think that this is something that research has an opinion on? Do we think we need extra research? I like to keep a very informal consultative style because of, you know, all the different ways we might want to approach something from a research perspective based on the objective. So we like to be included in planning and strategy. Just invite us to the meeting, you know, show us your roadmap, let us comment on it. Leave space in the timeline for research, you know, rather than being like, okay, we know we're going to build X and we need to start next week. Let's back up and say, maybe we need to gather some additional signal on topics related to that. So that's one thing that really helps, is just baking in some expected time for research to be conducted if it needs to be conducted. Researchers love to be asked, what do they already know about users? So anytime you're like, hey, have users ever mentioned this? Have we ever done a study on this? In all the thousands of users that you've talked to for the last 3 years is how long I've been working at Coinbase. Have people ever mentioned podcasts? You know, maybe you don't even need to read the full study. Just ask the researcher, do people ever mention podcasts? And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Let us help you do it yourself. I don't believe that all good research needs to be conducted by researchers. So if you feel like there's something you really need to know and you want to know it right away, then see whether or not there's the ability to have this researcher support you in doing it yourself. So that's my general personal philosophy on the best ways to engage with research. It can obviously look a little bit different depending on your environment or your particular situation. But I find that at the very least, it can help us get out of the cycle of just surveys, interviews, order up, short order cook stuff. It can really focus on research as the highest impact. So what are some other tips for scaling research impact? There's only so many times, only so many space in the timeline that we have. There's only so many questions that we can ask. So how do we make sure that we're conducting the most research possible and that we're using it in the most impactful ways? So this is an example of a quarterly planning process. It's one of my more preferred ones. So you can think of it as a lot of product managers, they like to plan quarterly. So as the quarter and the end of the quarter progresses, what are the different steps of engagement with user research that I've found the most successful in having a very good user-centered roadmap? So the very first thing that I always want to start with is, way before product is creating their roadmap for the next quarter, let's get together and let's talk about where the biggest product opportunities are. We already have so much knowledge. Let's talk about what are some of those actionable opportunities. This, I think, is the biggest place where researchers can have an influence on making sure that the company or the product is building and doing the things that matter most to users. Are we getting out in front of deciding what we're going to build? Let's talk about it first. Then product managers often draft their version of a product roadmap. They take tons of different inputs, like there are things that need to happen based on technical reasons. There are things that need to happen based on industry reasons. There are things that they personally want to see happen. That's all great. Based on that, I look at that step number 2, and I say, based on what they're planning to do, what research do I think needs to be conducted in order to get us there? So I like to look at the product roadmap first, provided that we've had that earlier discussion about like, okay, what do I think we should build? Hey, I think we should do a podcast. Okay, great. I'm looking at the roadmap. I'm hoping that I see podcast. Okay, great. So let's say that I do see podcast. Oh, okay. Product is planning on building a podcast this quarter. Then I estimate that we're probably going to need to do some, concept testing of like, what is the content that people want to see in this podcast? We might need to do a couple of marketing landing pages, put them in front of people, make sure that we're properly representing, some marketing materials for the podcast, make sure that that's resonating with people, that that's something that they think sounds interesting to them. So I'm going to plan out my research based on what is in that product roadmap. Then we get together, step number 4, we would review it together, just make, do we want to add things, edit things, subtract things. Then as product is getting a solid sense of exactly what's going to be happening that quarter, I look at that, what did they agree on? And then I'm going to finalize my research roadmap afterwards. So it's like you're almost like passing the ball back and forth. And it's a very collaborative process. And that makes sure that you're building the right things and that I'm conducting the right research that's going to be relevant. But maybe this is a very intensive process. Maybe you don't have very many researchers. Let's say it's a team. We are not able to support all the teams. I can't possibly go through this process with all the teams potentially, depending on what the ratio is. If you only have one meeting, have it be this first one. Because even if I never talk to a team because of bandwidth reasons, maybe I never talk to them after that initial meeting for the rest of the 3 quarters, then at the very least, I can tell them, here's what I know about your user base, and here are the things that I think you should do. And that is the number 1 most important meeting you can have. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about another way that I often help if there's only one of me and there's a bunch of million people that all need things. What are some of the ways that we can scale research? So this is a representation of the product development cycle and the kinds of questions you might want to know about users as you go. So at the beginning, you're starting with, we just want to understand our audience. We want to know who they are. We don't have any solution in mind yet necessarily. We're not testing whether or not we should build a particular thing. We really just want to understand who are people, what are they doing, and how can we use that to generate opportunities and ideas of things that we can do to meet those needs. Then once you have a solution in mind, potentially you've written a design brief for that solution, then you go into evaluative testing of like, now we're evaluating that solution. Is it the right solution? What should it look like? Should we consider something else instead? Can we make sure that the UX is good? So these are generally the 2 types you might call on the left, generative or foundational. I've heard it go by both terms. On the right, it's evaluative because you're evaluating a solution. I'm going to talk about something called guided self-service as my last topic, which is how we help product managers and designers conduct a lot of their own research for their particular product or feature. And it's really in this evaluative area where if it's usability, if we're just testing different concepts, trying to figure out which one we should go forward with, if we're just trying to get feedback on a feature, these are all evaluative forms. And I think that those are the ones that on the left, if it's generative or foundational as a researcher, I'm probably going to want to conduct it myself. That's kind of specialized. You kind of need to have some training and research to be able to do that. But on the right, I think that a lot of times product managers and designers are actually some of the best people to execute this kind of thing, provided that they're given the right structure. So why would we do something like guided self-service? And I'll talk about what it looks like in a second. But hey, it's a lot easier for me to support other people doing many different projects at once than to do them all myself. So it's increasing the overall number of studies conducted while I'm being just involved enough to ensure that it's a high enough quality bar, we're using the right methods, there's no major biases. So my bandwidth as a research team, it's never a blocker. I never have to tell you, no, I can't do that because I don't have the bandwidth or, that's not a high priority. If it's a high enough priority for you, let's make it happen. I can help you do it yourself. And I also think that there's some value in product managers and designers hearing the reactions from users themselves. Like, we all know that that empathy, it's like when you see a user struggling with a button, I can write you a million reports, I can write you bullets, and I can say users struggled with this button, but that's never going to be as impactful as you literally watching yourself, the user, just painfully struggle to find where the button is. I find that that's the quickest way to get product managers and designers to do the things that are most valuable to users. And I just think that it promotes user empathy. We should all be exposed to users all the time, not just the researchers. So as my last topic, I'll just talk a little bit about when I say guided self-service, what does it actually look like? So on the top there, you have the different steps in planning out research. You definitely want to define the research questions. We went over that. What is the anatomy of a research plan? What are the things that you want to decide when you're planning research? We do that together. I would always want to be involved with the designer or the PM in that situation, creating a research plan. Then I might, say, okay, I'm happy with this plan. We've worked on it together. I feel like I am comfortable with this being a good enough plan for you to go off and do it yourself. So once we move into collecting data and doing the analysis, whether it be a survey or interviews or testing a prototype, that's where I'm going to support from an administrative perspective. Maybe I'm going to get them the people or ensure that they have the infrastructure to be able to get the participants. But after that, it's mostly the stakeholders. They're watching the sessions. They're the ones who are writing up their notes and their findings and actually documenting it. And then I just look it over and make sure that it looks okay. So I go from a very collaborative, co-creating stance into just supporting you and making sure that you have everything that you need in order to get the data that you need. So I'm a huge proponent of usertesting.com. If you are not familiar with it, I highly recommend looking into it. I bet they didn't know that I was going to be super sales pitching them today, but this I think is some of the highest leverage. This is probably the highest leverage research tool that I think anybody can have, whether you're a PM or a designer. Maybe you're a startup, you're a one-person startup. I still think that this is one of the #1 most important tools that you can invest in. So just briefly, the way that it works is you can program a test. This is an example of a test that was actually programmed. You pick out what kind of participants you want. You say, oh, we want people who have this knowledge of crypto, this relationship to cryptocurrency. They need to be in the United States. They need to be on computers. And then you write them a little scenario of imagine this. And then you give them a prototype maybe, and they're able to click through the prototype. You're not present during the session. You launch it to their panel of people. And then asynchronously, they complete the test. This is on the right. This is a screenshot of a gentleman going through one of our prototypes, and it creates a video, and we're able to watch the videos on the back end, and we collect all these videos and then watch the videos of people going through the tasks that we wrote for them. So if you don't have a lot of time, then you can get video turnarounds in 10 minutes if it's a very basic audience that we're going for. So I'm a big fan of this tool. We call it unmoderated because moderating means there was an interviewer. In this case, there was no interviewer. There was nobody present. They were just going through a little script and doing the tasks that we gave them in this scenario. So because we use usertesting.com so much for that evaluative research, this is really what it looks like. On the top, researcher-led, that's what it looks like if I were doing it myself. But you can see that if I were doing it myself in the discussing the goals and approach, the collaborating on the plan, collaborating on design the test, I would be working in conjunction with my stakeholder regardless. It actually doesn't change that much. Pretty much no matter what, we're gonna wanna make sure that we agree on the research questions and the approach, and we're writing the questions together, programming the test. The only place where it tends to differ is who's watching the videos and who's taking notes. It can be anybody, did people stumble over the button? Did people give feedback that says they really don't wanna listen to a podcast, And so I'll launch the test for them, and then I'm just reviewing the findings. So it actually ends up being not that different in a way because it's a very collaborative process. And then I review their findings and say, yep, looks good to me, seems great. And then we move on. So I'm up on time. I know that's all the time that I have to talk to you today. So those are just some of my favorite topics in research. Coinbase is hiring, so here's my plug. You can email me if you would like to work in cryptocurrency. It is a very exciting space to work.
Cool. Thanks so much, Sarah. Really nice. So yeah, we'll open it up for Q&A. Welcome also to everyone watching that's not in our Zoom, feel free to type in your questions, and then we'll just read them out loud and have Sarah answer them for you.